following session, titled Preserving the Hierarchies, the Antidote to Woke Poison, will be presented by Nathaniel Pullmann, who serves as headmaster at Redeemer Classical School in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Please welcome Mr. Pullmann.
You hear the word woke. What do you think? Think of a guy in a dress being promoted to admiral.
Yeah.
Or maybe somebody being denied a job because his skin wasn't quite dark enough for me to make room for some diversity. Maybe a pride parade. These are the things that you'll see connected with this word if you pay any attention to conservative media of any kind. But that's not exactly our concern here, although it's related. I want to talk today about how it's related to our purpose and our work as classical Lutheran educators. We have quite a lot of ground to cover. So I hope you brought really fast pens to take notes. I want to talk about where Wokism comes from philosophically, because I had this quote as I was preparing this talk. This quote kept running through my head from John Maynard Keynes, who has his own difficulties, but it's this great quote: "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back." So this philosophy of Wokism, I think it's good to understand what it is and where these ideas come from so we can see how they lie underneath a lot of the debates and arguments that have been happening lately. Like a good Lutheran, I'm a few years late to this. So, debates swirling about what belongs in the Western canon. Should the reading selections for the classical learning test be? How should we choose our college presidents? And so, these things all have underneath of them this philosophy, and it comes out in subtle ways. So we need to talk about the philosophy, what it is, where it comes from. I'll give you some specific examples, and through those examples, we'll look at some ways that you can, some red flags maybe, you can start to see for when this comes up. These distinctive patterns of thought and speech that come out. And then how we can use those to spot this sort of anti-God philosophy and give you some suggestions for how to resist this pernicious and pervasive evil. Encourage you in that fight. There's nothing new under the sun.
Thank you.
The fundamental premise of Wokism goes back to the Garden of Eden, like most leaders. The refusal to believe that truth is knowable. God really can say. This has repeatedly reared its ugly head throughout history with the sophists and the academicians and the nominalists and more recently the postmoderns. They fundamentally believe the same thing. The sine qua non of each of us, the thing that they have to have for the rest of their philosophy to follow, is that there is no universal, knowable truth. Whether that's revealed or whether it can be discovered by human reason. They all deny this. Wokism picks up this thread, mostly through the Frankfurt School, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, and some French intellectuals, and mostly I'm going to focus on Foucault today. To sort of back up far enough to get to modernism would be far too much to talk about today, the collapse of modernism into postmodernism. And suffice to say that at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, many academics and philosophers retained a modernist idea that there is no God who has anything to do with our lives. but also denied the modernist belief in the capacity of human knowledge that came through the Enlightenment narrative. One group that does this is, as I mentioned, the Frankfurt School. Now, if you've read anything about this, you might recognize some names like Horkheimer or Adorno, Marcuse. If you've heard those names, it's the Frankfurt School. And what they said is that there might be sort of a universal truth, but we don't have any access to it. The things we learn through our cultures. We learn through our societies. And so we can't know what's absolutely true. We can only know what we've been told through the sort of prism of our society. They applied this primarily to what used to be called moral philosophy. Questions about what is man, what is justice, what's good for man, how ought society be ordered, how should peoples interact. This is now called sociology, tellingly, a term that comes out of this way of thinking. Instead, everything that we think we know, right, any knowledge that we have, is really a societally constructed narrative. And they assert that this social construct, this so-called knowledge, is of course constructed by the people who are in charge of the society. Nobody listens to the dock worker about what he thinks the truth is. Maybe they ought to. Plato thinks they ought to, but they don't. And so the people in charge of the society construct this knowledge for them. And of course, they construct it for their own ends, to keep themselves in power, to keep their wealth, and to keep down the people who are not in power. Originally, they applied this to systems of government. Like Marx, they applied it to capitalism, but they went a little further and also applied it to communism, right, and fascism. But relatively quickly, it got applied to other societal power structures. And that's sort of their way of talking, right? We might call it the order of creation. We'll get to more of that later. Things like men and women. Of course, men, having most of the power in society, are creating the knowledge that we all believe in order to oppress and keep down the women so that they can retain their wealth and power. And part of the interesting thing of this is that they say it's necessary. There's no choice in this. It's not like the men could do something else. They always do this. They always try to create social narratives that keep their power and keep other people down. You will oppress those who have less power because you'll construct the knowledge that is to your advantage and harm those that are not in power. And so any political power imbalance creates this oppressed group and the oppressor group. Foucault spreads this out even farther to more groups. Any distinction almost between groups of people, and the groups are somewhat arbitrarily arranged, but any distinction we can make between groups of people means that there is inherently a power imbalance. And he says that all people are subjected to their group identity. This is weird, but it's important, so bear with me. What it means to be subjected to your group identity is that you don't really have any individuality. You are your group. And this makes sense with the previous, because if there is no revelation, there is no God, but there's also no external, universal truth to which we can appeal. And all knowledge is just a social construct. How could you do anything besides follow that social construct? And so you are subjected to your group. There is no individuality. You have no way out of the cave. You have no way of separating yourself from the categories that society has constructed you into. Which means, of course, that if you happen to be in an oppressor group, like me, You are guilty of all the oppression that your group has done and is doing. And of course, oppression here just means being in charge of stuff. So, any distinction in power or authority in a society indicates a deliberate oppression of those who do not have power for no other reason than the domination of those groups. This is done by perpetuating truths that keep the oppressed down. And every difference in authority or power is oppression. And since there is no absolute truth, authority, or hierarchy that is legitimate, the only way to oppose this oppression is to oppress the oppressors. There is no utopia at the end of this. There will only be a new group of oppressors that then, in turn, need to be overthrown. Quote, I forgot to get out. Because this sounds quite absurd. So I wanted to give you an example in their own words. This is Ibram Kendi, if you know who he is. You know, he's a critical race theorist, so this sort of idea applied specifically to race. He says, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination, this is the good one, is future discrimination. Now, I can't tell if he is so sort of educated into this or if he's just dumb. This means, from his perspective, right, so he has these categories of white and black. I'm not really sure what either of those mean. I don't think he knows what they mean either. But from his perspective, right, the black people have been oppressed by the white people, and so now it's the turn for the black people to oppress the white people. But he's saying that in some future time, according to his own sort of philosophy, the white people should then oppress the black people. This is insanity. There is no sort of end state of this. Now, of course, you can see how this undermines God's good order on this earth. Pits man against man for often arbitrary reasons. But it's also an attack on God himself, of course. According to this theory, God is the ultimate oppressor. Because he is the one who does, in fact, create and is truth. So he's oppressing us, he's dominating us. But if you apply it to God, it becomes easier to see, perhaps, one of the obvious flaws in the logic. Because God is not only truth, God is also love. And so even if we grant many of their premises, which you shouldn't, don't do that, but even if we did, the whole thing sort of falls apart if those in power love those who are not in power. If husbands love their wives, then wives can submit to their husbands without being oppressed. So this philosophy of Wokism attacks the natural hierarchies that God has built into the world, into the order of creation. Not only men and women, but also God and man, right? Old and young, preacher and hearer. We have all these sort of hierarchies that God has put in the world. And of course, this attacks them. It says they are all inherently evil and oppressive and must be overthrown. But I think it attacks hierarchy in two other ways. The first is that it creates false hierarchies and then equates them all. And these false hierarchies, it's easiest to see maybe with the sexual revolution crowd. The woke philosophy acts like those of us who sort of believe in God's design for our bodies, or believe in chastity, have some sort of hierarchical authority over sexual degenerates. Certainly there's a moral better and worse, a hierarchy in that respect, which we'll get back to in just a minute. But this isn't hierarchical in the same sense that God has set this up in his good order, right? That we would have some sort of authority over them. Because sexual degeneracy is not part of his good order. He desires that they would repent or be destroyed. But, according to woke theory, the fact that most people in power have been straight men means that the straight men are oppressing the gays, right, and the trans, and all of that, somehow. So it sets up these hierarchies that aren't really hierarchies, and then puts them all together. Right? So the relationship between man and wife is the same as the relationship between a straight man and a gay man. Second, it goes back to that moral hierarchy. It destroys our ability to insist on hierarchies or rankings of morality, or even just of excellence, right? If I say that any idea or way of being is better than another, I am constructing a social reality, I'm constructing a knowledge that oppresses the group that I say is worse. So, if I say that for instance, if I say being healthy and thin is better, then I'm oppressing the fat, sick people. If I say that some cultures and ideas are better than others, I'm oppressing the other cultures. If I say that Western civilization that has come down to us from the ancient Greeks and the Romans, purified by Christianity, handed to us primarily through Europe, right? If I say that's the best culture, then I'm just a white supremacist. As we'll find out also in just a minute. Literally called white supremacy, right? And we need to bring in other voices into the tradition, which of course necessarily means excluding or removing voices that are already there. Lift up the oppressed, push down the oppressor. So, quick summary of this insanity. There is no objective knowledge, no real truth to which we can appeal, no revelation. There is only the societally created knowledge. This is created by those in power, and number two, it is created explicitly for the purpose of oppressing those who are not. So all power differential then becomes oppression. And third, you are subjected to your group identity, and so all group identity is guilty, right, if you're the oppressor, or to be lifted up if you're the oppressed, but by your group identity. It's going to be important in a little bit. By your group identity, not by your individual merits. Now, this is of course crazy. Oh, sorry. Back up one minute. And it attacks hierarchy in three ways. It attacks the divine order of creation. It says that all power differential is a hierarchy and lumps them all together. And then it says that no group or way of being can be better than another. So, like I said, this is obviously sort of an outlandish philosophy and seems quite crazy on its surface. And you might wonder, does this have to do with my classical Lutheran school? There's two answers to that. And the first is sort of a general answer, which is that you might not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And they will not leave you alone. Much more I can say about that, we don't have time. The second is that the enemy is already inside the gates. Camel's nose is under the tent, however you want to say this. In some cases, the whole head of the camel. So I want to give you some examples of that, and maybe some ways to see that coming, and some ways to oppose it. And I want to start with the broader classical education movement, not specifically Lutheran. And then we'll talk about some examples in the Lutheran Church where this is coming out. And I want to start with the most obvious. It'll be easier to see. We'll work to sort of more subtle variations of this later on. The lady named Jessica Houghton Wilson, some of you may have heard of. By the way, I wrote down a bunch of examples, and I practiced this speech, and it was like an hour and 15 minutes long. So I cut out lots of them, but there are lots more, and if you look up these names, I'm sure you can find many more examples of this. It might be worth doing. Jessica Houghton Wilson is a lady who has been featured by Classical Academic Press in their Women in the Liberal Arts Tradition class. She has helped develop the reading list for the classical learning test. So she's related to the stuff you may or may not be doing. We use some classical academic press materials, and we use the classical learning test. She has an article called, "Is White Supremacy a Bug or a Feature of Classical Christian Education?" Now, before we get to the article, just deal with that title. Like I said, that's the easiest example. Here's your first red flag. If somebody starts talking about white supremacy, okay, they're probably just engaging in woke doctrine. What is white supremacy? It's a good place to walk in. What is white supremacy? I mean, what would it actually, not what would it mean? Anybody? We want to define white supremacy?
White people are the best.
Yeah, okay, what's white?
Europeans.
European? Maybe. I think it would have to do with skin tone, right? There are some fairly dark-skinned Europeans that might not count. I don't know. Lighter skin? Yeah.
Whoever we need them to be.
Yeah. I said, what does it really? Now, what do they mean by that? Great. So, if your skin is paler than a certain tone, then you think that everybody who has darker skin than that is less than you somehow, is inferior to you. That's actual white supremacy. And it's gone on in some places sometimes. It's pretty rare in the history of the world. That would be actual white supremacy. Now, you guys have been around classical education for a while, some of you. Have you seen white supremacy in schools or at this conference or any other classical conference? Yes?
I have.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I
Not
have.
at this conference.
Huh?
Other classical education environments, yes. Yes, I have.
Wow, that's fascinating. I've never seen it. I would love to hear your example. Or, yeah,
I'd be glad to.
that'd be great. So, perhaps it is worth addressing. I do not think that it is a feature or a bug of classical Christian education. Is that fair?
What's that?
She calls it a feature or a bug of classical Lutheran, classical Christian education.
She's raising this question because we do have clear examples in classical schools of individuals who have put forward an agenda that is racist.
Okay.
One man was exposed by Rob Greer for this. He was a headmaster of a classical school in Louisiana.
Yeah, I remember this.
Yep. And he was clearly exposed for saying that he was advancing a racist agenda in the school.
Yeah, right.
So there are these things happening.
Okay.
So I do think we need to acknowledge the problem.
Yeah.
So keep going. I'll say something in the Q&A.
I do appreciate that pushback. That's good. Because this isn't really a joke. I mean, it seems sort of ridiculous to me, and so it comes off as kind of funny, but it's not. Because her claim is that it's about classical Christian education, not some guy in Louisiana. That it's either a feature or a bug of it, but that it is part of it. And she goes on in her article to give some examples of what that would mean. She says that we need to be lifting up more than white men in our ranks as wonderful speakers and teachers. But in the same paragraph, raises a conference where, quote, all of the keynote speakers were African American. She says, again, in the same paragraph, if the classical Christian school movement does not want to unintentionally deform its participants, we should be careful about the models we present for imitation. Of course, we should be careful about Of course, we should be careful about the models we present for imitation. But if the comparison is, if we put up white men as the model for imitation, we're deforming the students. And if we put up African Americans as the model for imitation, we're not. This is a pretty clear flag. This is not about making sure we have the best, the most Christian people up there, but simply that we care about the color of their skin. The second example is Annika Prather, who again is related to Classical Academic Press through the Black Intellectual Tradition lecture series they did, and that came out as a book that she was an author on. She has a couple of articles. The one I want to focus on is one where she praises Mortimer Adler, sort of in a backhanded way, for his development of the great books of the Western world. She says, unlike approaches that exclude diverse voices. Adler's criteria for inclusion in his Western canon demanded that authors engage with existing works, irrespective of their background or appearance. So, there's another flag that you want to start watching very carefully what they're talking about. They talk about diversity or diverse voices. Two reasons for that. One is that in sort of classical woke theory, diversity just means anybody with the power group. Diversity can't include the group that's in power, the oppressors. They can't be diverse. The other reason is that that's just not Christian. There's no call to diversity in the Bible. There's a call to unity. And then the assumption also, the sort of group guilt. The Western canon's current focus on the story of white people highlights its racial bias. The content of it makes it racist, simply because it has certain people in it. So diversity, right? She assumes that the majority of other approaches excluded people who were diverse, presumably because they were diverse. Yeah, she goes on to say that Adler's approach allowed for the expansion of the canon without arbitrary selection based on race or ethnicity, as though that was the norm. Arbitrary selection based on race or ethnicity. Ironically, she goes on in the rest of the article to promote that we should include people, voices, right, diverse voices that are black and female, which sounds to me like including people arbitrarily based on race and ethnicity. This word bias also comes up in a variety of forms. Here she says racial bias, but there's also institutional bias. Bias comes up, and the bias word is that word for being subjected to your group identity. You can't help it. Your group identity determines how you think, so you have a bias. And you can't really fix that. You can only sort of repent it. And then it doesn't go away, you just keep having it. These two examples, again, all these ended up being about classical academic press. I do actually use their stuff. I think a lot of the things are good, but you should know that this is what they're doing because I think it's worth being careful about. You notice that they're promoting both of those things, right? The black intellectual tradition, women in the liberal arts tradition. And this is sort of a third or fourth, I guess we're on now, red flag. Whenever we have sort of like a minority group in X, right? Or the minority group as an adjective thing. Women in business. Black Lives Matter. This is the one that I've had some pushback on before, and so I'm just going to try to make it clear if I can. The problem with this is that you're first doing the group identity thing. What matters is not that we found somebody who has a great idea or a great work that needs to be included in the tradition, but then we need to go find women, put them in the canon. Or that we need to go look at the black intellectual tradition, which I also just don't know what that is. Does she mean the Ethiopians? Or is it just anybody with a skin tone that's darker? And the way that I think is clearest to see this is that no one would ever accept it if we did it with the majority group. If they had come out with the white intellectual tradition, it would have had a revolt. They also would have been attacked by all of the mainstream media organizations in our country, racist. Another word that is common in this woke ideology is inclusion. Now, inclusion sounds fine, right? We should include people and things. But inclusion has to do, again, with this assumption that there's an oppressed group who needs to be sort of pushed into the other group. Brian Williams, the editor of Principia, which is Classical Education Journal, was interviewed about this women in the liberal arts tradition. He said, "We need to give serious thought to our inclusion of women in our curricula and to the tradition of at least African American voices from the tradition." He says, "This isn't a tradition of dead white European males." You're right, it's not. But the contrast, I think, is stark, right? We need to make sure we include the women and African American voices, and we need to make sure it's not a tradition of dead white European males. So there's some examples from the classical world. Like I said, there's a number of others. And some of these are worse than others, I think. But I think they're all worth paying attention to. But these ideas are also starting to float around in the LCMS. Some of them are older than others. Some of them had, like the Black Clergy Caucus, if you guys know about them or about their history, had sort of a legitimate beginning, but have now, they still go around like talking like they've been oppressed, or they are being oppressed. And again, if you reverse, right, put the majority group in there, put the White Clergy Caucus, we'd be the racist Senate. Nobody cares if we have the Black Clergy Caucus. We have, at some of our universities, we have Black and Hispanic student unions, where they say that all people are welcome, that they host Black Excellence Speaker events, support BLM. The Presidential Prospectus from Concordia, Wisconsin, said they wanted to have a president who demonstrated belief and commitment to equity and inclusion, and who promotes diversity in all its myriad forms. Again, I ask, what does that mean, diversity in all its myriad forms? I assume racial diversity. I also assume I don't know what kind of diversity. But certainly that diversity and equity, right? What is equity? Equity, again, in the sort of the woke terminology, means making sure that we have the oppressed group is lifted up to the level of the oppressor, also by pushing down the oppressor. We have other examples in the recent large catechism, with the essays at the back. There was, again, this is a smaller example of the capitalization of the word black when it applies to humans, and then not the capitalization of white, which seems like a very small thing, right? But it could be that he was just to be, following the AP style guide, which now says this. So maybe it's not particular to him, but that idea that somehow we need to elevate this group by capitalizing their skin color, and make sure we don't do the other one. We don't uphold sort of the order of creation with men and women with regard to protection. We should not have women fighting in the military to protect the men. And we won't say that clearly. So these things are, again, I think in a smaller way, creeping into a religious life also. And I think they're dangerous, and so I think we need to protect against them. So how do we do that? How do we do that in our schools particularly, because that's what we're interested here. And I said in sort of the explanation that I think classical Lutheran education is an antidote to this. I think it's an antidote in a few ways. The first is that in our classical Lutheran schools, we teach the Bible. And we teach the children the faith, we teach them the Bible, we teach them not to be ashamed of the Bible. A lot of this is built around shame. We teach the orders of creation and the hierarchy of morals. We can teach our students to say those things unashamedly. Dr. Preuss reminded us that we should not be ashamed to be called slaves, because we are, as long as we are slaves of Christ and slaves of righteousness. So much less so should we be ashamed to say the man is the head of his household and the wife should submit to her husband. That sort of rankles in the modern era, perhaps not in this room, so God be praised. We can also teach how authority is to be exercised from the biblical perspective. That authority is exercised not for domination and oppression, but out of love, with gentleness, giving honor to the weaker vessel. And so when these people come and say, well, that person in hierarchy over you is oppressing you, it will seem sort of ridiculous on its face. But classical education, classical Lutheran education is also about often what is best, what is good, so we can preserve sort of a hierarchy of excellence in morals as well. We should teach it that way. We should teach the students what is excellent, what is praiseworthy. And we should condemn the things that are not. I think also just some things that perhaps aren't exactly particular to classical Lutheran education, but learning history. Learning that perhaps our fathers didn't all hate and oppress the women in their lives. They might have loved their wives, might have loved their daughters. But there were actual arguments about things like women voting and women participating in the in writing, and press, and media, right? And those arguments were generally about vocation and not about whether one sex was allowed to write and the other was not. So, by teaching from a biblical perspective and from a classical perspective, we can learn to not only understand that hierarchy is something that God has given us for our own good, that it is something that God has given us to order the world well, but also that we should be unashamed of it, that we should defend it, that we should defend it not only in sort of the order of creation hierarchies, but also hierarchies of good and evil, that we should not allow people to push into those categories things that don't belong there. And so by teaching these things in our schools, I think we can raise children who will be much less susceptible to this, because I don't think that everyone who says these words means them maliciously. This is, again, like many things in the history of the world, the church lives in the world and sometimes picks up words and phrases and ways of speaking without really quite understanding the depth of the meaning of them. And so I don't want to come across as saying that all of these people are sort of out to get the church. They're out to destroy God and dethrone Him. I don't think many of them are. But I think they have been confused, and I think they have been co-opted by a woke ideology that is poisoned to the way we think and speak. You can't really use these terms innocently. I mean that in the sense that you can't, the term itself is never innocent. You can use it sort of innocently, morally, but the term itself always carries the meaning. And so if you push for equity, what you can mean is, we should make sure we're not excluding people based on the color of their skin. Great. We'll just say that then. And be careful about using these terms that have been developed explicitly and deliberately to oppose God and His creation. And so I think in our schools we can teach this, right? We can teach not only the dangers of what is out there, but also the counter to it, which is we always have to teach what is good. We can't just teach what is wrong and what we need to avoid. We teach what is good. So we raise up these things that are good, these orders of creation, these hierarchies And by upholding those, I think that's going to be the key to resisting the sort of poison of wokeism that might slip into our thoughts and our conversation. Thank you. I've done a little early, so we have plenty of time for questions. Yeah.
There was two things that I wanted to ask your opinion about, and some counter arguments for your section on what can we do. The
Sure.
first one is that we're called, westernizers, colonizers, and that the liberal arts is a culmination of an education for a bunch of old dead white men.
Okay.
The first example I like to bring up for this is in an effort to prove that, first of all, the liberal arts tradition does not stem from Europe. It stems from the Bible. It stems from the church fathers. Augustine is my first example. He wasn't white. He was black. Which leads right into my next point, which is that the liberal arts tradition, Western tradition, is a tradition of colonizers. And I immediately point to the fact that Christianity was not in Europe first. Christianity was in Africa first. It comes down to a semantic argument, but when you argue with people like this, they're not really usually open to being convinced. The reason why I like to bring these things up is for the sake of everybody else in the room who's listening, which can be a problem if you have a liberal professor in a classroom.
Sure.
Anyways, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think there's a problem with arguing that way. I think it's fine, but it sort of adopts their frame.
Yeah.
Right? It says that, no, it's okay, it's not white supremacy because we included this black guy. Right? I think it's better, I mean, it's true, it does sort of like undermine their point. Right?
Right.
But I think it's better to say that's not why these things were picked. We said let's find all the white guys and then like take their opinion. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I prefer to go at it that way. There is an undermining of their point that you can make there, but then you can just get into details about how many of which and whatever else. And so I don't find that to be quite as effective.
Okay.
Makes sense? Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Really appreciated your distillation of Foucault into an understandable way and helping us realize that critical theory is really, it ends up being itself, right? Each oppressive group ends up being the oppressor, and then it just keeps going, right?
Sure.
I do want to play David Peterson here and offer a little pushback, if I may.
No,
Like
please.
he does on many sessions. I don't mean that he'd agree with my pushback. I'm just, I always say my bad. He always has good critiques.
Yeah.
First off, I want to say I am totally against wokeness, okay, and that I've written about it, I've spoken about it, I resigned from teaching about it, okay, and you can listen to myself on issues, etc. about that. But I do think what I'm concerned about is a bit of a sort of what I might call a mirror image on the right emerging, sort of a woke mirror image. Okay, now I know this gets bantered about as Christian nationalism, this and that, and I don't want to talk about that. But I'm saying there are real examples in our classical education world. They may be few and far between, but there are real examples where you have sort of a mirror image of wokeness, where there are individuals who are pushing a white supremacist agenda. And I gave you one example. If you want to look up Rod Dreher exposes classical headmaster. Okay, you can find it. There's other examples as well, but I don't want to get caught in that. So my pushback is when it comes to Wilson and Crother and Farnham, I feel like you're cherry picking a little bit some of their quotes and such. I think if you engage with their whole corpus, I think there's a little more there that's worth thinking about at least. And I just want to give this quote from W.B. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk. So he talks about the color line in Souls of Black Folk, and he says this. I stride arm in arm with Aristotle, and Dickens, and Dumas. And when I do so, I rise above the veil. So what is he saying there? He's saying that those authors are his, right? And that those authors helped him transcend that racial line. right? Glenn Lowry made a similar argument like this a few years ago at the National Conservative Conference. He said, Dickens is mine, right? He went through this whole list of white people who were his, right? In the same way, I think I can say, Du Bois is mine. Frederick Douglass is mine.
Yeah.
Right?
Of course.
All those things. So I do think we just need to be super careful that we don't become sort of a reactionary, that's driven by reaction, right? Instead we want the plumb line to be truth, goodness, and beauty, right? And I think I can find truth, goodness, and beauty in Frederick Douglass' narrative of his life, right? Or The Souls of Blackfoot, right? So that's just what I want to offer. Again, a very good paper. I really appreciate you touching a hot nerve that's important to make sure that what this doesn't. I totally agree with that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your kind words. I do especially appreciate you saying that I cherry-picked the quotes, because I did. That's true, but I don't think it was unfair. It's just to say, I have read a lot of their work. Like I said, I have stacks and papers and stuff. And they would deny that this is what they're doing.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the part where I wasn't fair. They would deny it, but they keep doing it. And so, like I said, I don't think they're malicious about this. I think they're trying to actually make classical education better. That's their sort of internal motivation. I don't think they're trying to come destroy us. I think they've adopted a frame of looking at the world that is pernicious. And so that's kind of why I picked the quotes I did, because it demonstrates that frame. So I appreciate, though, because I should say that both of them have publicly denied that what I'm saying is true. And I should have said that. But I have been following this for a couple of years now, and they do actually keep coming back to this way of thinking. So, and I agree also that we shouldn't be reactionary. That's why I think we should teach what is good rather than fight against the evil primarily. Yeah.
I had a question, but before that, I just want to clarify that St. Augustine is not like sub-Saharan black, right? He's about as not you, sir.
Yeah. No,
I know you know that.
Yeah.
He's not black.
Fine.
By any ancient definition. The sub-Saharan, so they call them ideals. Right?
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, the point would be that they're, anyway, I think an Italian would be about the same color as St. Augustine. The question, though, or that's right, I think is the question. It might just be a comment. Is classical Christian education especially prone to sort of this mirror side of wokeness? Or is this just endemic in our culture, especially with young, angry men? And could you find as many public school teachers with racist tweets or whatever under a pseudonym as you would classical school teachers? And that's just an honest question. I don't know. I do know that when we first published Christian Culture for Lutheran Classical College, we had an article by Peter Scare, Dr. Scare, and he innocently, said in there that it's a good thing that there were interracial marriages, and we got attacked on Twitter by one of these guys, who said, "Really, this is the most trad and whatever other weird name thing we have going on in Lutheranism," and they published this revolt.
Yeah.
Right. So he's angry at that.
Yeah.
And I don't know where that's coming from, and if classical education is particularly prone to it.
I don't know if, but it might be, and I'll come back to that in just a second. It might be, and I'll start. It might be because it does, in fact, focus on sort of excellence and greatness in a way that other education right now is not. And so if you feel like you have become the oppressed group, right? If you have been taught this sort of education of greatness, you might sort of react more strongly than if you had been taught an education of sort of subservience get a job. So
Maybe
maybe,
the type of people with draws, perhaps.
right. The other thing is a good point that this reaction that both of you are talking about is simply the adoption of the principles that I talked about. It's actually, it maybe just moved faster than Kennedy thought it would, right? Because it turns out, if you look around at the sort of cultural institutions and the power centers in our country, it turns out that the white men aren't really in charge of them, right? And so maybe if you adopt this frame, they're now the oppressed, right? And so now it's their turn to start oppressing, right? So I think that is the danger, is that we adopt the frame. That's why I think we need to stay out of the frame as much as we can. We have to speak biblically instead of speaking in terms of whatever trad means.
And based.
Trad and based. I mean, I sort of understand what these guys are trying to get at, right? But we need to be careful when we do that we don't adopt it like we're subjected to our group identity. Because, I mean, go read about Foucault's life, and then you'll know that you should never ever follow anything he has to say. Yeah, go ahead.
Would this be a good framework? Because one thing I don't hear us talking about much, but I think is really the primal is racism. And it's a sin. I mean, there's categorically no question, and there shouldn't be in any Christian's mind, that racism is sin.
Sure.
So then, I mean, as we're teaching our children, maybe that's a way to say, like, we don't need this construct, right?
Correct.
What in your mind, is that a good framework to come from? Is, in our moral Christianity, it's sinful to degrade people, period.
Yes. You should be careful about how you teach it, because they've co-opted that word.
See, they take everything.
So if you just teach them that racism is wrong, when they go out in the world, they're going to be told that racism can only be done by the oppressor group against the oppressed. Right?
So is there a sub for that?
So if you're going to do that, I think you need to include this, at least some of this, and say, this is what we actually mean by racism.
Right.
That's what I was talking about.
Skin color. I
with
won't even use the word.
Right, with white supremacy, right? You just go through like, what does that actually mean? What is racism actually? And then you can talk about how it's against the Bible. But then you should also caution your students, the world isn't going to use racism.
Right.
What they mean by it is white people are bad. So, yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to share a really quick example of how classical education has maybe provided some insight. Because if you start with truth, beauty, and goodness, and you choose your materials, I tutored a 9th grade class, homeschool class, that first read Frederick Douglass's autobiography and then Booker T. Washington's autobiography, which I was shocked I had never read because I love to read and I didn't even know they were there. And they then had to write a comparison paper of the two men and write down similarities, differences, and the issue that we all ended up focusing on was not their skin color, but their human condition. How did they come, how did each of them succeed in their life? What was their faith like? What was their mother like? And so instead of it being, there was slavery in it, but instead of it being black slaves, white free men, it was, these were men.
Right.
Great men, great
Absolutely.
men. And they met the litmus test of, this is great literature too.
Yeah.
And it says truth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. I also don't, in my discussion of history, it's all very condensed, of course, but I don't think you should gloss over the fact that a lot of what Wokism is talking about was at times and places in the United States absolutely actually true.
Right.
Right?
Right.
There was white supremacy in some places at times, right? And we shouldn't gloss over that. You should talk about it. You should talk about sort of the discrimination that happened to those guys and how they overcame it. Great.
Within the context of truth.
Within the context of truth, within the context of actually, I think nobility, right, of those men, and how they overcame it, right, and hold them up as examples, rather than focusing on the wickedness of the oppressor, which is sort of how it's taught.
Which is there.
Yeah, of course it is.
It doesn't have to be.
Right, but when we teach the Persian Wars, we don't focus very much on the wickedness of the Persians, how awful they were to the people they conquered. You talk for a long time about it. They're pretty horrible. I mean, they invented stuff that made crucifixion look pretty pleasant. So, yeah, but we don't talk very much about it. We talk about the nobility, right? So I think the focus of how you teach those things, you can still teach them without sort of focusing on this class of like oppressor versus oppressed. Yeah.
You mentioned several different classical academic press as people maybe look at or keep an eye out for.
Yeah.
And I've heard, well, I know like National Exam has gone woke in some respects as well.
Correct.
Do you have any other classical oriented things that I should watch out or keep an eye out for as a teacher? What's kind of stuff creeping in?
I don't know, not off the top of my head. Anybody else have an example?
Might offer a helpful idea, or maybe it's just not. But I think that the debate largely from classical academic press has been about the canon of literature that we should study in classical schools. So you've got an ontology of literature that is great.
Yeah.
We have an ontology of history that could be organized by oppressors and oppressees.
Yeah.
But there is no world where Aristotle's categories are oppressing animist beliefs. Right? So in classical education, there are certain things that have worked and been profitable.
Yeah.
They're really raceless because they're in the conceptual world. However, as you observed, history, unfortunately, is a long litany of people variously oppressing other people.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But the confusion of this with everything,
Yeah.
and so when they go back and you talk about the offerings of certain groups, certain intellectual groups within the movement, their current focus has been largely on how can we sort of revivify, perhaps, and I hate to use the word because you're jumping right in, provide more equity in the canon of books that we read. Should it be expanded in the postmodern age? Are there more great authors?
I think the question of who should be in the canon is definitely an open question.
Yeah.
Right? And I think we should always be thinking about that. And if they had presented it as, hey, I think Sally, right, in 1412 wrote this really great book, right? And I think it should replace, right, Nicomachus of Garas, like nobody knows who he is, right? Then, okay, you can have that argument. But, right, that's not the way it's being framed. So I'm not opposed to discussion with the canon. I mean, it's not like Mortimer Adler like figured out what the canon was and then now we're done. It's a silly idea. But it's the approach to how we're going to look at the canon. Not, and actually, Jessica Hoogan Wilson does do this with a particular book that I can't remember her name. There's a lady who wrote something that she thinks we should replace Chaucer. She has an argument about it. I think it's a perfectly great argument to have. This lady's book deals with a lot of the same themes. You can actually read it to children, like Chaucer, right? So, okay, maybe we can have this argument. Great. I'm completely open to that. One other thing about Aristotle is that it is actually, this may be only in certain crazy universities, but we'll see if it comes out of there, right? Things like the categories are being racist.
Yeah, I know, that's kind of funny.
So, you know, that's your Western racist thinking that that's normal,
Yeah.
right? We should trust the witch doctors. They might know more about science than we do. Which, right? But probably not. So, yeah, those things, even like sort of the most basic things. Math was recent, right? They're saying that mathematics is racist.
That's a great example because a lot of our finite math are discrete math from the East.
Yeah, right. But they don't care about it like that. You can make those arguments, they just don't care. Because now it's white. So, yeah, go ahead.
Would you consider the inclusion of Eastern classics, like Confucius, basically, with Pullmann?
I would not, but that's way too big of an argument to have right now, and I don't think it has to do with Wokism. Sorry.
I'm just asking if it's red flag, you said no.
No, if somebody says we should include Confucius, that's a different argument, I think. I don't think that it could be Wokist, it would depend on how they presented it. I think it's an argument about what the canon is for. Good. I think we're actually out of time. I'm happy to stick around if you have more questions.